Welcome to episode 21 of Inside Politicz, for teens, by teens, where I explore the politics and issues impacting our generation. I'm your host, Christina Li, and today I'm focusing on the intersection of economics and public policy. For this, I've invited Megan Greene, Global Chief Economist and Senior Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School. She also has a bi-weekly column in the Financial Times on global macroeconomics and appears regularly on TV and radio outlets such as Bloomberg, CNBC, NPR, and BBC. Megan, how are you doing today?
Good, thanks. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, of course. So let's jump right in. So I guess for the teens who are watching this podcast, we hear the word economics a lot, but I guess we aren't so sure what exactly it means. So we might hear it in the context of like stocks or like GDP or other vocab. So could you do us a favor and define economics for us?
Sure. So this is a really complicated question, even though it sounds really simple. Economics, macroeconomics at least, is looking at how a country is producing output. And there are all kinds of things that go into it, but generally you're looking at, for example, the US's activity and output and the health of that relative to what its potential is generally. But economics is sort of one lens you can use to look at a whole bunch of other things. So as you point out, lots of people talk about the stock markets when they're talking about economics, because there's a lot of interplay between economics and finance. So economics is a lens that you can use to look at finance. It's a lens you can use to look at politics for sure, because policymakers are certainly changing the direction that the economy is going in or not, depending on what country we're talking about and when. So policy is a huge piece, and politics as well. And so you can also look at things like geopolitics, so kind of looking at big power structures between countries. So economics is one lens to look at a whole bunch of other factors, including finance, politics, also social trends as well.
Awesome. So I know you talked about how you can look at politics from an economics lens. So how would you say politics intersects with economics?
So politics dominates economics these days because policy is such a key point in what's happening in the economy. And that goes for our central bank, for example, which in the US is independent from the political scene, but nevertheless is impacted by it quite a lot and can impact the political scene as well. But also, for example, Congress in the US, they're in the midst of debating another stimulus package for the US economy. And whether they do or not, I think, will determine whether the US goes back into recession or not. So it really is the difference between growth or a contraction. And it's easy as an economist to talk about growth and a contraction and sort of use really detached phrases to talk about this stuff. But a contraction means loads of people lose their jobs. Lots of people might, either face eviction or face a huge balloon payment at the end of a moratorium on eviction. So if they haven't been able to pay their rent for months, at the end of this year, they might have to pay lots of months of rent all at once, which they can't afford. So there's a real human impact on all of this as well. But as I say, policymakers are really driving the direction of the economy, especially in the midst of a crisis like the one that we're facing.
Understood. So I know you talk about how policy affects economics, but what about vice versa? Does economics ever affect policymaking?
So economics definitely affects policymaking. If you think about it, we in the US right now are in an election year, right? And a huge input into how people are voting is how they feel about the economy and how they feel about their jobs and their income, things that they can really identify with. And so the economy can certainly serve to change the direction of politics. So that's a really obvious direct impact. But also the economy can demand action from policymakers. So in January of this year, for example, the US economy was kind of chugging along. Congress didn't have to do that much. The president had provided fiscal stimulus measures in the form of tax cuts that we saw a few years ago, deregulation, which has helped. Everything was just kind of working and chugging along. all of a sudden this virus hit, we all got locked down, and all of a sudden policymakers faced a totally different agenda. And so they had to spring to action, which they did really quickly. So the economy can drive what the job of politicians involves as well.
Got it. So I guess I know you mentioned the presidential election coming up. So from the view of an economist, how do you think COVID-19 will end up impacting the election?
So that's a great question. First of all, I think one thing that we didn't anticipate would be that virus management would be a huge deciding factor in how people are going to vote. So I think a lot of people will think, did the president do a good job addressing this virus, or did he not? And I think that will influence some people's votes. But then, of course, a second order effect is that the virus really affected the economy. So when we locked everyone down, we essentially put the economy on a deep freeze in the hopes that in a couple months' time we could contain the virus, defrost the economy, and ramp up production again, just like it was beforehand. And we've seen that with other not pandemics, but other outbreaks in terms of viruses. So we saw it with the SARS virus, for example. It was contained. It only took a couple of months. A year after, if you looked at the economic data, you hardly noticed this huge dip because we recovered so quickly. And this time around, it's turning out to be quite different. So this is lasting a lot longer than most people thought. We've had a hard time containing the virus. And it turns out the virus is going to determine the shape and the speed of the recovery. And so the virus is having a direct impact on the economy, and therefore how people feel about their jobs and their incomes and their standard of living, and whether they'll one day, do better than their parents did, things like that. And that outlook has dimmed quite a lot for a lot of parts of American society. And so that will affect how people vote as well.
Understood. So on the topic of the pandemic, I remember that there was a lot of debate between, reopening and the cost of saving the economy versus the cost of human lives. So as an economist, what did you think of that?
Yeah, so I thought that was a false debate. That was asking the wrong question, because the reality is that until we figure out how to contain the virus, and that will mean a treatment or a vaccine pretty much, until we figure that out, there will be no full recovery. So I think that a lot of analysts and economists were thinking, well, we've put the economy on a deep freeze, and so we can't have any economic activity until politicians tell us that we can go out again and spend money. But what we saw when states in the US started to open up was that actually the states that opened up really early had exactly the same spending patterns as the states that opened up really late, which means it wasn't the policy that was driving this, it was people's sentiment. So if you felt like going out to a restaurant or a bar was going to land you in the hospital, you weren't going to do it regardless of what some politician told you. And so I think this debate about, are we going to save lives or are we going to save the economy is just the wrong one to be having, because what we need to do is focus on containing the virus, because until then we can't have an economic recovery, because people are still going to worry that they can't go out and behave like normal and spend like normal, because it might wind them up in the hospital.
Got it. So I know at the beginning you talked about how economics informs social impact, and I also understand that you're writing a book currently that examines the gaps between theory and reality in economics and how they prevent us from addressing inequality. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. So I'm looking at income and wealth inequality within countries. So what we found over time is that inequality between countries has actually fallen pretty significantly over the past few decades, as some of the less developed economies have moved up the value chain and developed. But at the same time, income inequality within countries has increased pretty significantly, and nowhere is this more obvious than in the United States. And it's driven by a whole bunch of factors that we didn't really know about or have to contend with back when lots of people learned economics, lots of policymakers learned economics decades ago. So it's things like globalization, having open trade between countries creates winners and losers. That's a fairly new development within the past couple of decades, that we're only starting to realize, hey, there are losers from this. How do we compensate them? Technological advancements mean that, labor market forces are different. So for example, usually you've got a bunch of companies that as they grow, they build plants and they buy machines, right? But nowadays you have a whole bunch of new companies that are tech-based, and they invest in things like intellectual property, which isn't really a tangible thing. It's not like building a factory. And they tend to have far fewer employees. So how many employees does WhatsApp have, for example? It's far fewer than Walmart, for example. So there's this real division between bricks and mortar companies and these new age tech companies that affect the labor market significantly and mean lots of people don't end up getting wage gains. And there are fewer high quality jobs that are being created. There's another trend that I'm looking at called market concentration. So we found that 75% of industries in the US have become much more concentrated than they were a couple decades ago. And by concentration, I just mean a couple of big companies have risen to the top and bought up all the little ones. And so there's only a handful of major players in an industry. So if you look at tech, this is a perfect example, but you see it in retail and pharmaceuticals as well. And that exacerbates income inequality too, because if there are only a couple of really big companies that you can work for in your field and you want to change jobs, well, a potential employer knows you don't have that many options. There are only a few employers. And so they have much more power when you're trying to negotiate a new contract and trying to negotiate a new wage. And so they're going to say, no, we'll just pay you this much. Take it or leave it. And as a worker with only a few options for a new employer, you don't have much power. You kind of have to take it. And so wage gains have been really weak over the past couple of decades, and particularly since the global financial crisis. And so that's really exacerbating income inequality too. And it's interesting to be studying this all in the middle of a pandemic now, because this pandemic has been a huge accelerant for a lot of these things. So if you think about it, when we shut down all our businesses, well, all the small businesses that didn't have a huge cash buffer, when they had to shut down and had no customers, they went under, a lot of them. Some of them got federal assistance that has, is now running out. But a lot of these small guys couldn't withstand this deep freeze of the economy for a couple of months. But the big players have access to capital markets. They have many more avenues to borrow money and get financial support. And so they are surviving. So it'll accelerate things like market concentration, for example. We've seen the tech companies have done really well if you look at the stock market through this pandemic. And so, the trend towards technological innovation undermining worker power will probably accelerate as well. So the stuff I've been looking at before this crisis actually has just become more relevant through this crisis.
Understood. And I guess just pulling this back to, the mission of the podcast, which is to educate Gen Z on why they should care about politics. And I guess in this case, the intersection between economics and politics. So even though we might not have a 401k yet or a stock portfolio, can you tell the audience why we should care about this intersection?
Yeah, so finance is only one piece of economics, and it certainly can drive economics, but you should care about the economy and the intersection of economics and politics, because you care about your standard of living and you care about the people around you. And so, if you care about things like inequality, sustainability, resilience of an economy, if you want to have a better life than your parents had, if you want to have a house and a car one day, these things are all influenced by economics and therefore by politics. So I think, economics is sort of this term and lots of people don't really know what it means, and lots of teenagers just have their eyes glaze over the second you throw that term out there. But it really gets at the heart of what their lives are going to be like one day.
Understood. All right. That's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for joining me today, Megan. I really appreciate it. Stay safe, stay healthy.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. It was great to talk to you.
Of course. And I'll see everybody next time on Inside Politics. Hi, everyone. This is Christina. Thank you so much for watching Inside Politics. And please feel free to check out the rest of the interviews on my channel. See you next time.